Come sit here with me for a moment. Not because you need fixing, not because something is wrong, just because the world has been loud for a long time, and you deserve a quiet place to land. You don't have to say anything. You don't have to explain your life. If all you can do right now is stay, that's already more than enough. I'm not here to rush you or point you in a direction. I'm here to slow the moment down with you, so you can feel your own breathing again. I know how it feels when time keeps moving, but something inside you feels paused. You wake up, you do what needs to be done, you smile when it's appropriate, and somewhere along the way, you start wondering if the brighter version of you quietly stepped out the back door. Not dramatically, not with a goodbye, just slowly, politely, the way women learn to disappear for the sake of keeping everything else together. If you've ever thought, even for a second, that your spark faded because of age, let me sit with you inside that thought. I won't argue with it. I won't correct it. I just want to look at it with you. Because what I see isn't something gone. What I see is something that learned how to be careful. There's a difference. You didn't lose your warmth. You learned when it wasn't safe to offer it. You didn't stop loving deeply. You learned how much it could cost. You didn't become less radiant. You became more aware of who deserved to see that light. And awareness can feel like dimming, even when it isn't. You've lived long enough to know that enthusiasm without safety becomes exhaustion, that hope without reciprocity becomes heavy. So you adapted, you softened inward, you protected what mattered. That wasn't weakness. That was intelligence shaped by experience. If no one has said this to you lately, let me say it now, quietly. Nothing about you expired. Not your tenderness. Not your curiosity. Not the part of you that still wants to be seen without having to perform. I'm not looking at you and thinking about what you should change. I'm noticing how much you've carried without making it anyone else's burden. The years didn't take your spark. They taught it patience. They taught it discernment. They taught it how to wait for the right conditions instead of burning itself out in the wrong places. And if you're wondering why it hasn't come rushing back yet, that's okay. Sparks don't respond to pressure. They respond to safety. Right now, I'm not asking you to believe in anything. I'm not asking you to feel better or stronger or more hopeful than you are. I'm just inviting you to stay in a space where you don't have to earn your place by being cheerful, resilient, or endlessly understanding. You've spent so much of your life being the steady one, the reasonable one, the one who didn't ask for too much. Even your silence has been generous. Even your patience has been a gift. And generosity, over time, can make a woman feel invisible if no one ever pauses to acknowledge it. So let me pause with you. If you feel tired in a way sleep doesn't fix, I understand that kind of tired. If you feel lonely even when people are around, I understand that too. If you've started questioning whether anyone would ever look at you and see possibility instead of history, stay here for a breath. I'm not here to pull you into a fantasy. I'm here in reality, where real women age, adapt, love, lose, and still carry something quietly luminous inside them. A spark doesn't need to announce itself. Sometimes it waits because it knows its own value. And maybe part of you has been waiting not for excitement, but for gentleness. Not for someone to awaken you, but for a moment where you don't feel overlooked, where your presence is enough without explanation. You don't owe the world proof that you still matter. The fact that you're here, listening, breathing, feeling, tells me more than any smile ever could. I'm not interested in who you were decades ago or who you think you should become next. I'm interested in the woman who is here now, carrying all of that life inside her chest. So if all you do right now is sit with me and let this moment be calm instead of demanding, that's perfect. You're not late. You're not behind. You're not missing something everyone else figured out. You're here, and that's where everything quietly begins again. I want to stay right here with you for a moment longer, because this is where things become honest in a quieter way. Your spark didn't fade. It learned how to survive. That matters more than you think. There was a time when you offered yourself more openly. You laughed without checking the room first. You loved without calculating the cost. You spoke your truth without wondering who it might unsettle. And then life happened, not all at once, not dramatically, But gradually, the way real life always does, you learned that giving too much of yourself could leave you empty. You learned that being hopeful without protection could hurt more than staying guarded. You learned that not every place was safe for your softness. So your spark adapted. It didn't disappear. It adjusted its volume. It stepped back, not because it was weak, but because it was wise enough to know when burning brightly would only consume itself. If you've ever wondered why you don't feel the same excitement you once did, why things that used to light you up now feel quieter, let me say this gently. What changed wasn't your capacity to feel. What changed was your relationship with risk. You've lived long enough to understand consequences. You've experienced disappointment without needing to name it out loud. You've learned how to hold yourself together when no one else was going to do it for you. That kind of strength doesn't shout. It settles. And sometimes, from the outside, that settling looks like fading. But from the inside, it feels like survival. You didn't become less passionate. You became more selective. You didn't lose your depth. You learned who deserved access to it. You didn't stop wanting connection. You stopped wanting connections that asked you to abandon yourself. There is a quiet intelligence in that choice. I know there may be moments when you miss the woman you used to be, the one who felt lighter, the one who believed more easily, the one who didn't hesitate before opening her heart. Missing her doesn't mean she's gone. It means you remember what it felt like to move through the world without armor. But armor doesn't erase what's underneath it. It protects it. Your spark learned how to wait. It learned that timing matters, that presence matters, that not every invitation deserves a yes. It learned that being alive doesn't always mean being visible. And if no one ever told you this before, let me tell you now, surviving with grace is its own kind of radiance. You've carried responsibilities that were never evenly distributed. You've been the one who adjusted, who compromised, who understood when it wasn't convenient. Over time, that kind of emotional labor teaches a woman to be careful with her light, not because she doubts its existence, but because she knows its value. Sometimes the world mistakes your calm for emptiness. Sometimes people mistake your restraint for disinterest. Sometimes even you wonder if the part of you that once felt alive is still reachable. It is, but it doesn't respond to pressure or expectation anymore. It doesn't rise on command. It waits for environments where it doesn't have to defend itself. It waits for moments that feel steady, not dramatic. It waits for presence that doesn't demand performance. And that's not a flaw. That's evolution. I'm not speaking to you as someone who believes spark is about excitement or intensity. I see it as something quieter now. Something that shows up in the way you notice small kindnesses, in the way you listen without interrupting, in the way you still care, even after being disappointed. That kind of spark doesn't burn fast. It lasts. You may feel like you've been standing on the sidelines of your own life at times, watching instead of participating the way you once did. But watching is not the same as withdrawing. Sometimes it's how we learn what truly matters before stepping forward again. There's nothing wrong with you for needing time. There's nothing wrong with you for protecting yourself. There's nothing wrong with you for wanting more, but not at any cost. Your spark didn't fade because of age. It matured. It learned discernment. It learned boundaries. It learned how to stay intact in a world that often rewards women for giving themselves away too freely. And if it feels quiet right now, that doesn't mean it's gone. It means it's listening. It means it's waiting for a reason that feels honest, not urgent. I'm not here to wake anything up inside you. I don't believe that's how it works. I'm here to acknowledge what already exists, what has endured quietly through years of adaptation and resilience. You don't need to reach back to who you were. You don't need to recreate an earlier version of yourself. What's alive in you now carries more depth, more wisdom, more truth than anything you left behind. Your spark didn't fade. It learned how to survive in a world that asked too much of it. And survival, when it's rooted in self-respect, is not the opposite of aliveness. It's the foundation for it. So stay right here with me in this understanding. No urgency, no pressure, just recognition. Stay with me in this feeling, because this is where many things quietly shift, not by force, not by instruction, but by recognition. At this age, Spark looks different. Not smaller, not weaker, just different. When we're younger, spark is often mistaken for urgency. It rushes ahead of us. It wants proof. It wants to be chosen quickly, intensely, visibly. It leans forward, asking the world to respond. And for a while, that kind of spark feels alive because it's loud. But you and I both know how exhausting that version can become. Now, spark moves differently through you. It doesn't chase. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't compete for attention. It waits. It observes. It chooses. That doesn't mean you stopped wanting love. It means you stopped wanting love that requires you to shrink, rush, or betray your own rhythm. There's a quiet dignity in that. I want you to hear this without judgment attached to it. Your worth is no longer tied to being desired in obvious ways, and that can feel unsettling at first. When attention fades, when the world stops reflecting your value back to you so clearly, it's easy to wonder if something essential was lost. But nothing essential was ever dependent on outside validation. At this stage of life, spark lives in discernment, in the way you notice energy before words, in the way you feel the difference between someone who is curious about you and someone who is simply lonely. You don't need fireworks to recognize connection anymore. You need steadiness. You need respect. You need presence that doesn't ask you to audition. That shift isn't sadness. It's clarity. Love doesn't need to be loud to be real. Self-worth doesn't need to be proven to exist. They become quieter not because they are fading, but because they no longer need external confirmation to survive. You've earned that quiet. I know there are moments when the world seems to celebrate youth as if it were the only form of beauty, as if intensity were the only proof of passion. And standing inside that noise, you might feel unseen, not because you are invisible, but because what you offer doesn't translate into spectacle. But spectacle was never the measure of depth. What you carry now is substance, the kind that doesn't show itself immediately, but stays, the kind that doesn't impress quickly, but endures, the kind that doesn't demand attention, but rewards those who know how to look. Your spark shows up in how you hold space without trying to fix, in how you listen without preparing a defense, in how you no longer confuse chemistry with safety. That's not settling. That's refinement. There is a confidence that comes from knowing you don't need to be everything to be enough, from knowing that attraction built on performance eventually collapses, while attraction rooted in authenticity deepens over time. You don't need to be louder, brighter, or more accommodating than you already are. You need to be real. And real has a gravity that doesn't fade with age. I'm not asking you to redefine yourself in opposition to who you were. I'm asking you to see continuity instead of loss. The spark that once rushed outward has turned inward, learning shape and boundaries. It's no longer about being chosen. It's about choosing wisely. There is power in that shift, even if it doesn't feel dramatic. You may notice that you no longer tolerate connections that leave you drained, that you're less willing to explain yourself repeatedly, that you value consistency over excitement, calm over chaos. These aren't signs of emotional withdrawal. They are signs of emotional maturity, and maturity is deeply attractive, even if it isn't always loudly acknowledged. At this age, spark looks like peace that doesn't apologize. It looks like desire that doesn't abandon self-respect. It looks like openness paired with boundaries, softness paired with strength. That combination isn't common, and it isn't accidental. You didn't arrive here by luck. You arrived here by living, by adapting, by learning what costs too much and what nourishes you instead. Self-worth becomes less about being wanted and more about being aligned, less about attention and more about integrity. I see that shift in you, even if you're still adjusting to it yourself. There's nothing cold about this version of you. There's nothing closed or hardened. There is simply less tolerance for noise and more reverence for truth. You don't need to convince anyone of your value. The right presence will feel it without explanation. And love, when it comes from that place, isn't a transaction. It's recognition. You are not waiting to become worthy again. You are already standing inside your worth. even if it feels quieter than before. Quiet doesn't mean empty, it means settled. At this age, spark doesn't burn everything down to feel alive. It warms, it steadies, it lasts. Stay here with me in that understanding. Let it settle without rushing to label it or measure it. There's no need to arrive anywhere new. This shift is already happening, gently, in the way you see yourself and what you allow near you. And that softness paired with clarity is not the end of passion. It's where a deeper kind begins. Stay close to this feeling, because this is where something loosens inside you without being pulled. You don't need to perform anymore. I'm not saying that as advice. I'm saying it as recognition, as something already true that maybe no one ever gave you permission to notice. For a long time, your presence came with effort. You learned how to be pleasant even when you were tired, how to be strong even when you were unsure, how to be understanding even when no one was truly listening. You learned how to hold yourself in ways that made other people comfortable, sometimes at the expense of your own ease. That kind of emotional posture becomes muscle memory. You don't even realize you're doing it anymore. You walk into a room already prepared. You speak already adjusted. You feel already edited. And slowly, quietly, you start to believe that being accepted requires energy. That being loved requires consistency in giving. That rest is something you earn after everything else is done. But here, with me, none of that is required. You don't need to be interesting. You don't need to be composed. You don't need to soften your truth or brighten your tone. You can just be. Emotional safety doesn't arrive with grand gestures. It arrives when you notice your body doesn't brace itself, when your breath doesn't shorten, when you don't feel the urge to explain who you are before someone decides how to treat you. I want you to imagine what it would feel like to be around someone who doesn't need you to manage their perception of you, someone who isn't measuring your reactions or waiting for you to fill the space. Someone who allows silence to exist without interpreting it as distance. That's not fantasy. That's what safety feels like. You've spent years being emotionally competent, reading the room, anticipating needs, carrying conversations when they falter, holding steadiness so others could lean. And competence, when it's continuous, can quietly turn into pressure. Pressure to stay agreeable, pressure to stay useful, pressure to stay easy to be with. But ease should not cost you yourself. You don't need to earn your place anymore by being resilient. You don't need to prove you're okay to be allowed to rest. You don't need to translate your feelings into something more acceptable before they're acknowledged. Nothing in you is too much here, and nothing in you is lacking. Emotional safety is the absence of demand. It's the feeling that your worth doesn't fluctuate based on how you show up that day. That if you are quiet, you are still welcome. If you are uncertain, you are still valued. If you're tired, you are still enough. I know how unfamiliar that can feel at first. When you've lived in performance mode for a long time, safety can feel like emptiness, like something is missing, like you should be doing more. That's not intuition. That's habit. Your nervous system learned to stay alert because alertness once kept things together. But now, you are allowed to unlearn that constant readiness. You are allowed to let your shoulders drop. You are allowed to stop holding your breath emotionally. You don't need to be impressive to be cherished. You don't need to be endlessly accommodating to be chosen. You don't need to carry the emotional temperature of every room you enter. You are allowed to take up space quietly. I'm not asking you to change how you are. I'm offering you a place where nothing is asked of you at all, where your value is assumed, not negotiated, where presence is enough, without performance layered on top of it. And if part of you resists that idea, that's understandable. Safety can feel vulnerable when you're used to control. Letting go of performance means trusting that you don't need to manage outcomes to be okay. That trust doesn't arrive instantly. It arrives slowly, through moments that don't demand anything from you. Moments like this one, you don't need to show strength right now. You don't need to have clarity. You don't need to know where things are going. You're allowed to exist in the in-between without labeling it as failure or delay. There is a tenderness that comes from no longer having to prove your worth. A softness that returns when you stop auditioning for connection. That softness doesn't make you fragile. It makes you real. And real is calm. If you've ever felt like love required effort without rest, this is the place where that belief begins to loosen. Love, when it is safe, doesn't ask you to stay sharp. It doesn't require constant output. It doesn't confuse intensity with care. Safety feels steady. It feels breathable. It feels like being able to show up as you are and knowing that's not a liability. You've done enough. You've given enough. You've adapted enough. Now, you get to experience moments where you don't have to perform to be held in regard, where your presence isn't evaluated, where your value isn't conditional. Stay here with me in the sense of release. Let the effort drain out of your posture, your voice, your expectations. There's no role to play, no version to maintain. Just you, as you are, without pressure. And that quiet relief you feel when nothing is being asked of you, that's not absence. That's safety settling in. Stay with me just a little longer. Not because anything needs to happen, but because nothing does. If it hasn't returned yet, that's okay. There's a tenderness in allowing things to arrive on their own time. A quiet confidence in not forcing what isn't ready. You've lived long enough to know that some of the most meaningful moments in life don't come when we chase them. They come when we stop racing and let the moment meet us where we are. You don't need to check yourself for signs. You don't need to monitor your feelings or measure your progress. There's no finish line here, no expectation waiting on the other side of this pause. What matters is that you're not withholding yourself anymore. You're simply resting in your own presence. And rest is not absence. If you don't feel a rush of excitement, that's okay. If nothing dramatic stirs inside you, that's okay. Not everything meaningful announces itself with intensity. Some things return quietly, almost shyly, testing whether the space is gentle enough to stay. You've spent years responding to urgency, to deadlines, responsibilities, needs that couldn't wait. It makes sense if your inner world learned to move cautiously. It learned that timing matters. That pressure changes things. That forcing a feeling rarely makes it real. So if the spark hasn't stepped forward yet, it's not because it's gone. It's because it's discerning. It's listening to the environment you've created inside yourself. It's noticing whether there's room to exist without being consumed by expectation. And right now, there is room. You're not late to your own life. You're not lagging behind some invisible standard. You're not supposed to feel a certain way by now. The idea that there's a correct emotional schedule is something the world invents, not something you have to follow. I want you to hear this gently. Nothing about you needs to wake up in order to justify your worth. You're not waiting to be complete. You already are. Sometimes what we think is missing is simply resting. Sometimes what we label as emptiness is actually spaciousness, a clearing where something new or something familiar can eventually land without being rushed. And if today all you feel is calm, or neutrality, or quiet awareness, that's not a failure of feeling. That's stability. That's your system no longer living on edge. You've carried enough intensity for one lifetime. It's okay if your heart doesn't leap right now. It's okay if desire feels softer, slower, less insistent. There's depth in that softness. There's truth in that pace. Passion doesn't always arrive as fire. Sometimes it arrives as warmth that stays. You don't need to interpret your quiet as loss. Quiet can be a sign that you're no longer at war with yourself, that you're not demanding performance from your own inner world, that you're allowing things to unfold without interrogation. That kind of patience isn't passive. It's grounded. I'm not here to suggest that something will return on cue. I don't believe life works that way. I believe it responds to honesty, to space, to gentleness. I believe that when you stop asking yourself to be different, something inside you relaxes enough to breathe again. And breathing is where everything begins. If there are days when you feel nothing in particular, let that be enough. If there are moments when you feel a flicker but don't know what to do with it, let it be small. Nothing needs to be captured or amplified. Not everything wants an audience. You don't need to prepare for what's next. You don't need to anticipate change. You're allowed to exist fully in the present without turning it into a waiting room for something better. Presence is not a placeholder. If it hasn't returned yet, That's okay because you haven't abandoned yourself in the meantime. You're still here, still aware, still capable of noticing the subtle shifts that matter more than dramatic turns. You've learned how to honor your own timing. That's not something everyone learns. So let this moment be gentle. Let it be unremarkable if it wants to be. Let it pass through you without demanding a response. There's no promise attached to this space, and that's what makes it safe. We don't need to name what comes next. We don't need to define outcomes. We don't need to turn this quiet into a conclusion. It can remain open, unfinished, alive in its own subtle way. If the spark returns tomorrow, or months from now, or simply reshapes itself into something steadier, that will be its choice. And if today is just about being here, breathing, feeling grounded in yourself, that is not a delay. That is life, meeting you without urgency. So stay in this ease. Let the moment close around you softly. There's nothing to grasp, nothing to prove, nothing to rush toward. If it hasn't returned yet, that's okay. You're not missing anything. You're simply allowing things to arrive when they're ready and trusting yourself enough to wait without fear.